Untold stories in the airwaves, flying through the night. Experience voices, tales so bold. Streaming live, the truth unfolds. Untold Radio Network, where secrets come alive. New episodes daily, the mysteries thrive. Great guests, super chat, so I remember I share and subscribe. Join the side where truth can't hide. Aliens in the attic, UFOs in the sky. Cryptids lurking, oh my, oh my. Ghosts in the hallway, whispering your name. The paranormal, the unexplained. Become a VIP, get the inside scoop. Unlock the mysteries, be part of the group. Live streaming stories are talking to you. Super chats buzzing, join the crew. Untold Radio Network, where secrets come alive. New episodes daily, the mysteries thrive. Great guests, super chat, it's a wild member ride. Share and subscribe, join the side where truth can hide. So if you've got the guts and you want to explore, tune into the Untold, it's what you're looking for. From aliens to ghosts and all that's unseen. Untold Radio Network, where the world's mysteries convene.
Hey Untold Radio Network fans, want exclusive perks and to support our channel? Introducing our YouTube membership program with 3 amazing levels. Get loyalty badges that level up to different cryptids the longer you're a supporter. How cool is that? You'll also get access to custom Bigfoot emojis and priority in chat. Upgrade to Backstage Pass for exclusive wallpapers, photos, status updates, discounted books, and merchandise. Go all in with the producer level for everything mentioned plus member shoutouts. Ready for an enhanced experience? Join now, pick your membership level, and let's make this journey even more exciting together.
The paranormal, UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your host, Dr. Dean Bertram.
Good evening, all my fellow weirdos and weirdettes, and welcome to Talking Weird on the Untold Radio Network. I'm your host, Dean Bertram, and as always, I'm delighted that you're joining me tonight, whether you're watching when the streams go out on a Tuesday night, Central Time at 9 p.m. in the US, or whether you're watching where the streams are archived, the video streams, whether that's on YouTube or on X or on Facebook, or maybe you're listening just to the audio of the show on one of many Facebook platforms, or rather one of many podcast platforms, which are wherever you podcast, it's available, as are all the other fantastic shows on the Untold Radio Network. I recommend you check out some others if you're just a Talking Weird listener. I've been so super ridiculously busy. As most of you know, I run 2 film festivals in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, MidWest WeirdFest, and a Night of Horror International Film Festival, which I used to run in Australia, but I've since bought to the Northwoods, where I now reside. They run simultaneously this year in the same cinema, downtown Micon Cinema. It's a twinplex, so each cinema has its own screen, and it is 4 days from March 6 to March 9, just jam-packed with strange cinema, horror movies, thrillers, science fiction, a bunch of amazing shorts, and a stack of incredible documentaries, including, I think, the greatest documentary about the Loch Ness Monster or about any aquatic cryptid that I've ever seen, because it's a film we'll be talking about tonight. We're very fortunate that we have the director with us. The movie's called Loch Ness, They Created a Monster. And it does something particularly unique, which is a documentary myself I'm particularly interested in. It looks at the history of the people who investigated the Loch Ness Monster, the people who helped bring that legend to life. And the amount of the amount of archival footage in there, as well as current interviews with people, it's stunning. It was submitted to the festival, and the second I watched it, I was just blown away, and I knew that we had to have it at the festival. The director himself is an award-winning documentarian. He's both a producer and director. He's worked with various acclaimed networks, and he's made a number of features, and he's worked with skills both in the UK, where he's based, and overseas. His work, he's well known for emotion, wit, drive, and visual flair. He charms the talent, and he gets the very best out of all his interviewees, and you can really tell that when you watch the film that I'm talking about. So without any further ado, I think I'll just invite on the one and only incredibly talented John MacLaverty.
Dean, how are you?
It's so good to have you here, John.
Thank you very much for that ostentatiously generous welcome. Thank you very much. I was blushing here in Scotland, but yeah, and I'm really glad you like the film. It's like no matter how much you think your film is good or you're pleased with it, it's always gratifying. No matter when somebody says I liked it, that's the words you want to hear, you know. And I imagine even if you're like absolute top end director, you know, at the Oscars, and somebody says I really liked your film, you will never get tired of hearing that, you know.
I think our audience are going to love it at MidWest WeirdFest as well. It's such an incredible movie that I know the content that my audience like, and they're going to adore it just as much as I did. And we're going to get into a lot about the film tonight, a lot about what got you into the film. But maybe I have one cheeky question for you. Are you wearing a kilt by any chance?
No, but I do have a kilt, and in fact, you know, the film is quite Scottish, and people are interested in Loch Ness because are sort of like, it's an iconic Scottish thing. So when you know, when the film first came out, we previewed it at a festival that adjoins the Cannes Film Festival called Cannes Docs, and I went to Cannes wearing my kilt. And when you wear a kilt, you have to walk like John Wayne. It's a sort of strange thing. Like, I mean, even if you don't walk like you've got to stride about, because then again it gets a nice flap, and you know, like it's great fun to wear. Although, you know, I remember somebody once saying to me, "Well, why are you dressed up as a Scotsman?" It's kind of like, you know, being from Canada and dressing as a Mountie or something like that. But it is. I mean, years ago I made a documentary about the kilt actually as well. So it's as a kind of iconic costume. It's good fun to wear, and you know, people always ask you about tartans and all that stuff is kind of BS. But you know, it is good fun to wear, and we're lucky to have it because, you know, when you're walking down the street in a kilt, people actually sort of smile at you or sort of laugh at you, but they like it. They're not like laughing at you in a sneering way. They're sort of going, "Oh, cool! There's a guy wearing a skirt and a jock frock," you know. So it's sorry, jock is a Scottish word for Scotland, you know, but people from Scotland. But yeah, it's good fun to wear.
It's funny. I've actually worn a kilt myself when I was a kid. I have a couple kilt stories, but I'll tell two of them quickly, I guess. One is, I remember when I was younger, and you were talking about the kind of the mythology of, the tartans and the family significances and all of this stuff. My family was meant to be, on my mother's side, we were meant to have the Stuart tartan was meant to be ours through a various, long background of a family tree that winds all over the place. But so I remember being in a kilt store, I think in London of all places. It wasn't even in Scotland, when I was a little boy, and my mother picking out some Stuart tartan for herself. But I wore the Stuart tartan when I guess I don't know, it wasn't an altar boy, it was like a page boy or something. And when my grandmother, who's now passed, did her, I suppose her initiation's the wrong term, but when she was bestowed upon the title of the honorary or the orderly, I think, what was it, maybe orderly matron or something, like the head of an Order of the Eastern Star kind of, what do you call them? Lodge, because it's the female version of the Masonic Lodge. In fact, they even do it, I think, in Masonic lodges. But she had me as her page boy, and there's a photo of me still, which exists, me wearing that Stuart tartan kilt. So I have once worn a kilt, once.
Good for you. You can be ambitious. You can get your legs out again at some point.
You know what? I plan to, before I shuffle off this mortal coil, I do have to wear a kilt again. I think we'll play the trailer in a minute just to let people have a sense of what the film's visually like and some of the amazing content that's in there. But before we do, I had another Scotland-related question and to the movie for you. I suppose all of us who grew up outside of Scotland and grew up with an interest or even just a cursory interest in things like Loch Ness Monster, as I did as a kid, I certainly was raised on In Search Of, which is also in your documentary, and we'll get to that in a minute too. But so we have this attitude of the monster, this mythical type being, but what's the general attitude in Scotland? Like, is it looked at as serious, or is it just looked at like as a silly tourist thing? Or
well, it is. It's changed. I mean, the period that the film talks about is when it was seen as quite a credible thing, that there was something to discuss. Whereas I think now it's much more seen as a kind of like slightly tongue in cheek. I mean, there are still people looking for it, and there are still, but it's more like a mascot. Nessie is more like a mascot than anything in Scotland now. In the research for it, I did speak to some local people who claimed that they had seen something, So there are, like, in fact, I was quite surprised that there was a number of people who, were like, yeah, no, I think there is something in the loch, but most of us are kind of like slightly dismissive of it with a smile. There's a question I asked people who lived up at Loch Ness. I always think if you're from Loch Ness and you go on holiday, to Spain or somewhere like that, and people say, "Oh, where are you from?" and you say Loch Ness, where the conversation's going to be. There's no. So all these people have had to go through this conversation a number of times. But I mean, people are gentle about it. There's not. People aren't angry and going, "No, there's no monster," and they're not vociferously going, "Yes, there is a monster." It's just like it's a subject discussed with a smile and not taken too seriously.
I've been to Scotland only once when I was a young adult. I think I was about, late teens, early 20s by myself. And I took the train ride up the East Coast, and it's such a beautiful journey. I visited a friend in Aberdeen, but I didn't actually get to Loch Ness. That's another thing on my wish list. I do have to get there one day. I love just the scenery of it, which you see so much of in the film. But maybe on that, you happy for me to throw to the trailer?
Please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Let's watch it together, then we'll come back and chat about it.
Scientists by the expedition full roam the lake. The big push to find conclusive evidence that huge creatures live in Loch Ness.
Long neck, smallish head, and a huge hump body, which I reckon was 30 feet long.
I've really got to get this photo. I feel that I'm the one that's going to get it.
It was just interesting, and we didn't make money out of it or anything.
Loch Ness is a magnet for monsters, myths, and madmen.
We feel so strongly with regard to the reality of what we have that we think is the 10th wonder of the world, if you will.
Do you believe it?
I am totally convinced that the people with the latest investigation are honest and serious-minded men.
When was it last seen?
That's a difficult one.
This picture is genuine and shows what appears.
Absolutely.
I don't believe these latest photographs prove a thing.
Have no doubt that some will still accuse you of faking the pictures.
The thing we call the Loch Ness Monster is really a mixture of rotting vegetable material, logs, tree stumps, tree roots.
What happened at Loch Ness was that there was considerable belief.
You just kind of hope.
Some things have to be believed to be seen.
it's an amazing trailer for an amazing film, and I'm so honored that we get to have the US premiere at MidWest WeirdFest, which takes place March 6 to 9 at the Micon Cinema in downtown Eau Claire. I love a lot of things about your movie, and we're going to talk about a lot of them. I think the thing that I love the most is the approach that you took to this, because there's so many documentaries which just look at the phenomenon, whether it's lake monsters or whether it's UFOs or whether it's Bigfoot or ghosts, while you had this wonderful idea and wonderful approach in this movie. Two is those who were just listening and weren't watching the trailer, if you just wanted to listen to us on an audio podcast site. The trailer says that you turn the cameras around, you focus on the monster hunters instead. Can you talk a little bit about that approach and what made you go in that direction, and how I guess the gestation of the whole idea?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, to an extent, there was a kind of saturation of documentaries about the phenomenon of whether or not a monster existed in Loch Ness. And over the years, they got kind of less and less convincing, and but they all sort of have a format where they show you the kind of wobbly pictures, and they show you like some splashes and ripples, and there's kind of and the question is always like, is there a monster in the loch? And the question I kind of wanted to take it from was like, well, most of the monster hunters come from out with Scotland, and I mean, and the prime era of monster hunting was the 1970s and like early 80s. There was a rush in the 1930s as well, but it was sort of like 60s and 70s was the kind of golden age of it. And I wanted to know, it was equally mysterious to me to go, well, why did these people move their lives from different continents to Scotland because they believed there was a large dinosaur-like creature in, a relatively modern European country that nobody had ever seen before, which is quite a big ask. I mean, like, you can't prove an absence, you know what I mean? Like, the weird thing was like, and part of what the film argues is almost that these people created the idea of the monster as much as they went looking for it, because throughout, from around the world, TV crews would come to Scotland and they go, all right, let's do the Loch Ness story. Everyone likes that. And they would go up to Loch Ness. And of course, you can film the water for a while, but it's not great TV, like the surface of a loch, or a lake, as you guys would call it. And then, so what have they got? So they need to speak to eyewitnesses. And a lot of these people sort of made their living by being professional sort of Loch Ness hunters, if professional is the idea. It's almost like, the Memphis Mafia around Elvis. There was a kind of, people who were kind of satellites who orbited. So there was these people who lived around the loch, and they had relatively different degrees of credibility in that, some of them were very scientifically minded and were desperate to prove that they weren't cranks. And others were sort of more kind of liberal with the truth, or more, how would you say, creative maybe, and who wanted to say, who would tell them like the shaggy dog story of the monster, where they had seen something. And of course that's sort of slightly better copy in a way. If you go and see someone and they rationally say, well, we can't rule it out, and blah blah blah, it's not inspiring to, like, you, Dean, as a 9-year-old kid, right, watching Arthur C. Clarke or In Search Of. You don't want that. You want somebody who gives you a shiver down the spine, So there's and one of the quotes that I thought that was, I can't remember where I read it, but I thought it was a good quote, which is that wonder makes a fool of us all. Now, wonder is a great thing. Wonder is a beautiful thing. It's like, when we look at the stars, we all wonder, and it's like, it's an amazing feeling. You feel small, and, but it can sort of like, so, we all want there to be a monster, and we all want there to be something in the loch. And the film doesn't set out to kick that really at all. But it is then, but once we put the Loch Ness monster hunters under scrutiny, it was a bit more sort of like, a lot of their stories sort of like crumble a little bit around the edges.
And I think that's one of the reasons it's not only so interesting, but so important. It's funny, and we're here to talk about your film, not about mine, but as viewers of this show and listeners know quite regularly, I'm still in production on a feature documentary called The Man Who Invented Flying Saucers, which is about Ray Palmer and Richard Shaver and kind of the lead into UFO myth. And I have a short called The Shaver Mystery, which is on the Fest circuit at the moment. But to me, it was so obvious a choice in the UFO realm to do something which looked at how these ideas and myths were generated originally and were popularized. And that's something your film does incredibly well. I'm almost envious. Like, it makes me want to raise my filmmaking game up to another level. Maybe we can talk about some of the personalities which were so important in the development of what was going on at Loch Ness. I have a couple specific people to ask you about, but who were some of the entities that really, or some of the individuals who really popped out to you, who seemed important and interesting in the story?
Yeah, well, the main guy, and I mean, you've seen the film, and we don't want to put spoilers in, but the main guy was a guy called Frank Searle, and he, I mean, some of the stuff about him isn't in the film. Like, you know, he had a wooden leg, right, and he was an ex-Cockney soldier who moved up from London to Loch Ness to look for the monster, and he lived in a tent for a while, and then he had a caravan, and he became the main guy who he embodied something, because he was like the loner with binoculars and cameras who was there all the time. And, you know, he really was, you know, like he, you know, Loch Ness in the winter is a cold, dark, not particularly pleasant place, even more so in the 1970s. And he, you know, he was living in a tent and then a caravan beside the loch for quite a long time. And, you know, and he sort of got lucky. He got lots of photographs of the monster, and for a long time had a relationship with a tabloid newspaper in Scotland called the Daily Record, where he would sell pictures to them and they would put it on the front page. I mean, it wasn't, you know, ha ha ha, a man caught a vision or something. It was like front page news. So Frank was like amazing and really interesting to speak to. And, you know, he wrote a lot down. You know, he wrote a couple of books. He wrote a book called 7 Years in Search of a Monster. And also he had an unpublished book. And we you know, I read all those books and took those words. So he was great to speak to. There's a guy called, who's in it, who's a Japanese monster hunter called Yoshio Ku. And, or actually, I think it's pronounced Ko. And I think he was Chinese originally, but sort of was a Japanese pop promoter. He lived in Japan. And, you know, like, for example, he brought Tom Jones to Japan. But when I started looking into him, I was like, I want to make a documentary about this guy. Now, you know, indulge me in a little sort of sideways stories about him.
Sure.
He, at one point, tried to set up a show. He did all these crazy shows for Japanese television. He tried to set up a show called Man v Tiger, right? Where they put a tiger in a cage, and the idea was to put a karate fighter in the cage with the tiger, right? And see who stepped out the cage. And the only reason it got stopped, I mean, I looked into this, and the only reason it got stopped was because Brigitte Bardot wrote to President Carter, who then, because Brigitte Bardot was an animal rights activist, and then he sort of put pressure on, I think it was like the country that was going to host it, and say, no, you can't do this. You can't have this. But an extraordinary, like, unlikely chain of events. And the other thing he did, and forgive me, this is quite full on, but like he brought a monkey there was a chimp called Oliver that walked on its hind legs. Some of your people might know about him. And it's quite a famous kind of case history from the 70s. And people tried to teach it to be like a human. And Yoshio Ko, this guy who's in the documentary, went looking for Loch Ness Monster. But again, just backstory. He paid for a first-class flight for this chimp to fly from America, smoking cigarettes on the plane, to Japan. And he toured Japan because the chimp walked on its hind legs and very little hair in its head, so it looked slightly human, right? And he advertised, and he wanted to show were to create what he called a chimpanzee, where they would get a female volunteer to try and create a chimp-human hybrid. Now, I mean, by all, like, genetically, that'll never work. But he tried to do this, and then that got stopped as well. So he's out there, you know. I mean, like, really, like an incredible guy.
But he also promoted I think Muhammad Ali is with him in the documentary.
Yeah. He brought Muhammad Ali over after Muhammad Ali finished his boxing career. He did a fight in Tokyo where he was fighting a kind of a multi-martial arts disciplinarian or guy who beat him because he could kick his legs, you see. So, but anyway, but Yoshio Ko organized a Japanese expedition to Loch Ness, and he got a fortune of money, right? And like, you know, I didn't know if he still existed or not, and then when I tracked him down, and we got him for an interview. I mean, the budget in this show is not high, so I didn't get to go to Japan and meet him. I did it sort of via over a laptop with a remotely hired crew. And I don't speak Japanese, and he doesn't speak English very well. So we did the interview, but like, he was wonderful because he sort of didn't really care about the empirical truth of it. He liked the romance. That was his thing. He was going, you know, I mean, they went for like 6 months, and they were really well funded, and they had money from, like, you know, Japanese like corporations, and you know, they went looking for it, and you know, he had his girlfriend was there, and the musicians and like, you know, poets, and there was a very famous writer came with them as well, and they chugged up and down Loch Ness for like 6 months, didn't really find anything, but were perfectly happy with that. You know, they were sort of like, they were going, this is a quest. It's not like, it's, you know, it's very different from some of the other guys who were like really trying to scientifically prove it. Yoshio Ko was kind of going, I want the adventure of going to look for a monster, and that's what I'm going to do, because there's supposed to be one in Scotland. So I'll raise, you know, in the mid-70s, $500,000. I'll get like I'll have a whole press conference. I'll hire a submarine. I'll go up to the loch. I'll spend some time there. I'll drink whiskey, and then I'll go home. And he seems perfectly delighted about it, the whole thing. So he was great. And then there are finally, there's a group of sort of like amateur sort of biologists or amateur naturalists who really did want to find it and believed it. And some of them, like there's a guy called Tim Dinsdale, and he spotted the monster on an early trip up, and then became obsessed with it. So I mean, of course, you can understand that if you go somewhere and you encounter something really that blows your mind, you know, he then became obsessed by it. He chucked his job, and he kind of like would come up to Loch Ness, and actually, you know, some of the footage we couldn't get. He toured the US and you know, was on the chat show circuit, and you know, like he made quite a living talking about the monster as well, but we couldn't find some of that footage because it was the 1960s. But yeah. So there is there's a range of people who went looking for the monster, and they're all interesting, and they've all got different motivations. And for a while, they were all in the loch at the same time, which led to a sort of like competitive thing. And the final thought, I think, is like, you know, this was like 60s and 70s when science was progressing rapidly, and people were sort of like, you know, almost everything was getting explained quite quickly. You know, physics and all that was jumping on, and things were getting explained, but there was something simplistic about the quest for Loch Ness Monster, that you go, I'm going up there, and I'm going to look. And if I see it and I get a photograph of it, I will have changed scientific history forever by dint of being a kind of keen amateur. So that attracted a lot of keen amateurs.
I think one of the many things I love about the film is it does capture that period you're just talking about, that keen amateur, those Japanese corporate-sponsored expedition that you were talking about. It brings to mind when I would watch In Search Of, which we can talk about as well, which is featured in there with the wonderful late Leonard Nimoy's resonant voice explaining the potential that there was, you know, some creature in the loch. But I think we forget today almost, or it's easy to if you're new to the space, just how seriously the potential for there to be a plesiosaur was taken back then, that there might be a plesiosaur in in Loch Ness. Like, it was a serious endeavor, and there were major press conferences about it. Can you talk about, I forget their name now. I know many of the researchers. I'm glad you brought up Tim Dimsdale too. We might come back to him. But the researchers who got the famous photograph of the flipper and the head, how that became a national news or an international news story as well.
Yeah, the chap was called Robert Rines, and he was a very successful patent lawyer in America who'd made quite a lot of money. And you know, I mean, a lot of the story around the expeditions to find it were almost like the quest thing was quite big in that, you know, a lot of ex-military men would get involved because, you know, and if you're an ex-military man in the 1970s, then you were probably fighting in the Second World War, you know, like, because, so these guys, you know, went off and did heroics during the war, and then, you know, came back and raised a family, and then suddenly they were like, you know, 60 or, you know, late 50s, early 60s, or 65 years old or whatever, and they wanted a challenge. You know, they wanted something, but they're not going to go to the Borneo jungle, like, and you know, research a rare type of mosquito or something like that. But they can go up to Loch Ness, get loads of equipment, have sort of military-style planning, and try to capture the monster. So, yes, it was taken seriously, and you know, one of the bits of footage that I punched the air when I found was like David Attenborough. Who's essentially, I mean, I'm sure you guys do know of him, but, you know, certainly in Britain, he's the most respected, you know, natural history voice. You know, he's sort of like a member of the royal family here. You know, people just like, you know, he could read the phone book and people would like sit and listen to him. And I found a clip of him from the 1970s giving it credence, you know, giving it like, he didn't say he believed in it, but he said, I think it's a possibility. Now, that would now seem absurd to people, because it's sort of, you know, and again, this is one of the things I was interested in, that people risk the reputation by going to Loch Ness, because even at this high point of belief, you were subject to ridicule. And I sort of think that a lot of what happened was, you know, people risked ridicule by going up there and setting up and declaring that this is what they were trying to do. They were trying to find the Loch Ness Monster. But then that sort of put them under a wee bit of pressure to come up with evidence. You see, so like if you're like Robert Rines, as I say, this wealthy lawyer, he invested a lot of money in it and actually got some of the top men in kind of like sonar science at the time. I mean, like, you know, because again, this kind of detail I didn't put in the film because, you know, you don't want to bore people with an encyclopedic kind of thing. You want to go, you know it. And, you know, so some of the people who invented sonar and a thing called side sonar and all this, like, they were all dragooned into like coming over to the loch in the summer. Now, you imagine you're a guy who's a really bright guy in the mid-70s and you're at Stanford or somewhere like that, and somebody says to you, do you want to bring your tech over to Scotland for a couple of months? We'll drink some whiskey and we'll look for a monster. Yeah, I do. That's exactly what I want to do. That's what I want to do, you know. So these guys went over to Loch Ness and like and they gave it credibility as well. I mean, weirdly, they were kind of like, you know, would be subject to kind of quite slightly snarky criticism from the press, or snarky questions. But because of the caliber of people who were going over and the amount of money being invested, you know, it was sort of gave it like some credibility. I mean, and there were bonkers things as well. Somebody tried to exorcise Loch Ness, and you know, there was, you know, people believed that it was at one point a ghost of a monster, and you know, and so there was stuff that was like never taken seriously. But and there was stuff that was sort of slightly jokey, and there were a lot of hoaxes. Again, I didn't really get into that in the film, but I know about quite a few hoaxes about the Loch. But yeah, you know, it was essentially taken quite seriously, and there was a lot of belief around it, and it wasn't like laughed out of court the way it would be to an extent now. And you know, one of the guys, like, there's a guy up there called Willie Cameron who styles himself as Mr. Loch Ness, and he's a lovely man. He's really funny, Willie, and you know, he wears the kilt and does all the thing for the tourists. But his dad was a cop, right? His dad was a cop up at the Loch, and at one point, his father had the longest sighting of the monster, right? And you know, it was a sort of 20-minute sighting, or whatever, and you know, he saw it, and then like, but what his father did afterwards, his father and another police colleague, was they wrote down all the accounts. They found all the people around the Loch and who didn't know each other, and like independently wrote down their accounts, and they all kind of matched up. And as Willie would say to you, he said, look, in a court of law, that stands up as evidence. If like, you know, 20 people see the same thing from different perspectives who've not confided in one another, that's solid evidence, you know. So there was a lot of, you know, when I was making it, you know, I started out skeptical and agnostic, but it's funny when you meet people and they sincerely believe in things, you don't want to be like horrible to them. You don't want to say you're lying or, you know, or you're a fantasist, because clearly they're not. I mean, clearly people have seen things and are interested in them. So, you know, I became a little bit more sympathetic to the, you know, to the sort of like the idea of it. And, you know, but also, I mean, one of the slightly glib things I would say to people is like, you know, this is like when fake news was fun. You know, fake news was fun and monsters lived in lochs. You know, I mean, there's a sort of weird sort of nostalgia for it. So, because the world is very difficult place now. But yeah, I mean, it was certainly taken seriously. And one of the motivating factors for making it as well was there was lots of archive footage, because if you go to Loch Ness, even in the 1970s, you bring your Super 8 camera. You know, should we bring the camera to Loch Ness? Nah. You know, I mean, nobody's going to say that, you know? So, yeah, I mean, it was very much a thing, and it was quite it brought a lot of people to the area as well.
I have so many questions for you, and because we're limited in time, I don't think I can ask them all, which is frustrating. I would like you to tell me a little bit about, this is as much a question for me as for the audience, how you went about researching this. Like when you grabbed onto this, what was your approach to it going forward? Like, did you read, I guess you read a bunch of books, I'm guessing you watched a lot of films, but what kind of direction did you go in with that research early on in development and pre-production?
Yeah, well, I mean, when I'm doing any documentary, it's sort of like, it's not that you have to tell the definitive story, or it has to be an encyclopedia of Loch Ness or whatever subject you're doing. I think, well, what's the insightful thing? What is the thing that when you watch it makes you go, ah, that's interesting. Yeah, I'd never thought about it like that. So, you know, I sort of like, I looked into the characters, and Frank Searle, who I mentioned earlier on, and it's a little bit of a spoiler, but not too much. You know, the moment I thought, oh, there could be a really good film here was when I found out that Frank Searle threw a petrol bomb at other Loch Ness monster hunters. He attacked a rival camp of Loch Ness monster hunters, and you go, wow, that's kind of weird. You know, that's like, you know, everyone knows the kind of slightly whiskey and haggis version of Loch Ness, and I'm like, hold on a minute, there was like territorial wars about finding a monster that nobody could find. That, you know, that's bald men fighting over a comb, you know, that's amazing. So, like I sort of, and also Frank, he had this kind of like slightly dubious thing that he would seduce young girls to come and stay in his caravan. And like, he was not particularly a handsome man, you know, he's like a guy in his 50s with a wooden leg. And yet, you know, there would be young female tourists who'd come to Loch Ness and end up shacking up with Frank in the caravan. And again, people are base, including me, and you go, you know, sex and violence and you know, the things about Loch Ness that you do not think, because we all think like, you know, you can hear the bagpipes and you can see the wide shot of like the scenery, and you can, you know, they always interviewed old men who'd sighted the monster. And I'm going, well, it's interesting, like, sorry, one tangent, Dean, is like, I think the Loch Ness story is fundamentally told by people who are not Scottish. Fundamentally told by like news crews and all that coming in. So I thought it was kind of an interesting thing to go, well, we're a Scottish company, and I made it, BBC Scotland provided the money and Screen Scotland provided the money, which is the kind of cinematic agency here. And I'm like, right, well, let's tell it from our perspective. You know, let's sort of go, well, we're the only ones who have not told this story. Yeah, I mean, I wanted to sort of try and tell it in a different way. I didn't want to be mean about it, because I don't think, you know, there's no point in making a documentary that's about bursting everybody's balloon. Nobody likes you. You know,
yeah,
what I mean?
And that's another thing. There's no meanness in it, which is something else I really appreciated, actually.
Well, I mean, you know, you'll deal with a lot of films about unexplained things, and it's like, you know, even if you're not necessarily like an evangelist for the cause, you know, it's not hurting anyone, and asking questions in itself is a good thing. So, you know, so I slightly took the view that, like, well, we want to sort of like slightly celebrate this, and in the part of the, again, it's not giving much away to say this fact. I mean, again, I found out that, like, you know, the Loch Ness region, you know, earns about like, or the Inverness and Loch Ness region earns about £200 million a year, right, in tourism. And then, you know, like, Inverness is a nice little town, but like, it's not necessarily, people don't necessarily go to Inverness. So a very conservative estimate, we found out that, like, Loch Ness brings in £50 million a year for an area which has got about 5,000 people in it.
Wow.
Right? And it's like, you know, it's not jam-packed. I mean, if you guys go there, you can find total desolation and all, or isolation, and, you know, you can find a place to be alone and look at the loch, and it's great. It's not jam-packed, but it brings in lots of money. And a lot of that is due to the fact that we all watched things with Leonard Nimoy talking about mysterious lochs when we were wee kids. You know, everybody loves, so it's the power of storytelling to an extent that you're going, the story, like, you know, if you build it, they will come, you know. I mean, it's like the story of the belief in the monster is enough for, you know, and even to this day, like, you know, cruise ships come into Edinburgh in Scotland, and, you know, tourists get off and they're asked, where do they want to go? And they say, Loch Ness. And, like, they get on a bus and leave Edinburgh, which is a stunning city. You should stay in Edinburgh. But, like, leave Edinburgh and go to Loch Ness and, like, look at the loch and then come back in a bus. And it's amazing. It's just that things lodge in your head and you go, right, I want to see that, you know.
How did you feel, just to rewind a little bit, if you ever saw it as somebody from Scotland, when there was the Ted Danson vehicle, the Loch Ness, which is, you know, a Hollywood type production, a fictional story of that film, which came out in the 90s. How did you see that back then? Or?
Yeah, no, I saw it, and like, I mean, there's an episode of Scooby-Doo and the Loch Ness Monster, and there's like, you know, there's lots of, in fact, funnily enough, at one point somebody thought they'd found a dead Loch Ness Monster, and it turned out to be a prop from an Ealing film from the 1960s that had sunk to the bottom of the loch. And on the sonar, they found the shape of the Loch Ness Monster. And like, we found the monster. And then they kind of like went down, and it was like a prop from a 1960s film about the Loch Ness Monster. So, I mean, but that, I mean, I think Scotland, like any small country, is flattered by attention, right? You know, and it's sort of a hilarious thing. I mean, even like, you know, so we're happy to have Ted Danson come and do a film. That's great. You know, who cares? That's good. And like, you know, even things like Braveheart and all that, you know, the whole concept of freedom didn't, like, that wasn't really a concept that like Scottish peasants would have in that era, you know. So like, I mean, I like the film, and you know, it's good and all that, but like, I just think all of these things, we kind of welcome it. It's, you know, you welcome attention. Scotland's a country of about 5 million people, beautiful scenery. We've got whiskey. We've got, like, you know, we've got lots of kind of iconic stuff that is that people like, and tourism is a big part of the business. And so, you know, there is a sort of slightly like, there is a occasional, like, a little laugh up the sleeve after you come out the cinema, but most people are happy with it. I mean, I know somebody who was an extra in that Ted Danson Loch Ness film, so, you know, people like it, you know.
I'll be honest, I do love that film. When I first watched it with my daughter because it was on Amazon Prime, one of the streaming services here. I'd never seen it when it came out in the 90s, but she was into like dinosaurs, so I thought this would be something that she'd dig. And the first time she watched the documentary, your documentary with me as well, and she loved it. She's such a Nessie fan. She's 9 now, but when we watched the dancing movie, she was probably like.
You see my Nessie? Sorry, you see that? I've got this out for a prop for the back of the shot.
Oh wow! There we go.
Right, see, we could fake that up. I should put that there like that.
I'll show that to her.
yeah.
But when we were watching that film together, I thought she was going to sleep. She was lying down on the couch next to me, and when the film finished, and you see I'm sure people have seen the Ted Danson Loch Ness movie, but at the end, when you see the plesiosaur family swimming underneath the water of Loch Ness, my daughter, I thought she was asleep, and she popped up, and and the credits start to roll. She said, again. She just wanted to watch the movie again, because I do think, I know as a child, and maybe we can go to In Search Of now. I know as a child, one of my earliest probably introductions to it was probably In Search Of. There were probably other things at the time as well, but In Search Of, which you mentioned before, was a big part of my interest, I think, in the Loch Ness Monster. As long as every mystery book I had as a kid in the 70s going into the 80s, the Loch Ness Monster was one of those big things. So had you seen In Search Of when you were a kid? Or
well,
I mean, it's a big part of the film. I mean, it resonates through it.
It's more of an American sort of show, I think. I loved there was a series in Britain called Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World.
Good show.
I loved that, and again, that was sort of like UFOs and all that stuff. But like Loch Ness is was the classic local news, or was the classic last story in the news. They would when there was a kind of slow news day. It was kind of like a new sighting had been reported or whatever. And, there was skepticism about it, but of course, you send a reporter up to the loch and they have a great time, and, they can get a story out of it, and nobody really resents it. It's like, who doesn't want wonder in their lives? Who doesn't want mystery? So, and the sort of, when I saw In Search Of, or when I found that footage, it was familiar to me, although I can't really remember watching it. But it's so like something out of The Simpsons, isn't it? I mean, it's sort of like, you can practically, I mean, God forgive me, I don't know this, but you can practically feel Leonard Nimoy like going backstage, counting his cash and going, "Can I go now?" Because he just has to walk on and, stroke his chin and say, maybe there is something there. And and you imagine them breaking for lunch and then coming back to do the Yeti and then coming back to the UFOs and and good for him, no, I've got no bitterness about it. I'm going, great, that's fun. And as you alluded to, when we were kids, we watched that stuff and we're like, oh my God, that's amazing,
We mentioned Frank Searle before, and I'm not going to give any spoilers, but I adored the way Frank Searle was dealt with in the documentary, of the way you approached it, and it was just wonderful. Like, I was really like, this is fantastic. I was so pleased. There's been a modern kind of Frank Searle as far as somebody's parked themselves at the lake, and he's in it as well, right? Steve Feltham.
Steve Feltham. Now, he's a lovely, lovely man. He's honestly like, he's the real deal. In that, if you guys go to Loch Ness and you go and speak to him, he will chat to you, and he's honest. Because he said to me at one stage, he said, "I'm gonna put outside my caravan. No, I haven't seen it yet." because he moved up there and he set up in his little hut on a beautiful little beach, and he saw something once, but not inconclusive. He saw something he didn't understand, and he lives there and he chats to people who are visiting, and he sells little things, and he actually, and documentary crews like me go to him, but he's still there. He's been there for like 30 years. He's there tonight. He will be there looking for it, and it's. Does he sit like glued, like he's a sentry? you know, on the front line of a war. No, he doesn't. You know, he potters about and gets in his car and goes to the supermarket. And, you know, I mean, he's got a life and, you know, and all that. But yeah, he likes to, you know, he thinks it's a privileged existence. He doesn't go, he's like, I'm not like a loser. I'm not like a, you know, I'm living by the loch in a beautiful place. I'm sort of not really like working in a kind of 9-to-5 job. You know, I meet people, they're interested in me, I'm interested in it. I don't know what's going to happen. And, you know, great, good for him. And like, he, you know, he says to me, you know, that people turn up and go, you know, I don't believe in the monster. And he's like, well, great, that's up to you. That's not, that's not hurtful to me or anything, you know. So he's a really, really nice man. And, you know, he's got a Facebook page, Steve Feltham, and he talks about sightings, and if there's a new sighting, he'll discuss it there, and he's got a lot of followers. So, you know, you guys who are interested in Loch Ness, you should check him out, because he's kind of like the real deal.
No, I've always thought he's fantastic as well. There's actually, I think it's on YouTube, there's a short documentary. He might have been paid by a British, I can't remember, it was BBC or what's one of the other ones, ITV or something.
Yeah.
But there's a documentary he made when he first went there.
Oh yeah.
When he's a young man.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's kind of incredible, because he's kind of, you know, the thing about him is he arrived much later than the other monster hunters, but he went to visit them as a kid. And, you know, he says this in the documentary. He says, you know, he went to see these guys looking for the monster and said, that's what I want to do, right? You know, stop the bus. That, like, I have to say, I like what I'm going to do. Like, you know, as a kid, he thought, I'm going to come up here and look for the monster. And he did it. And he's kind of, you know, I mean, I think the Inverness Tourist Board should pay him like 40 grand a year to just sort of be himself. And you know, he's really nice, and he's not like, you know, he's not like a wild-eyed loon. He's like a really lovely, rational, smart guy, you know.
He's always seemed very genuine. I don't know him at all, but he's always seemed very genuine to me. And I've always enjoyed looking at his Facebook page and seeing what else he's been up to. And it's such a fascinating story. And you know what? Really, a heartwarming story too, that somebody could go and spend their life doing what they most wanted to do. Like, how many people stay in a cubicle for their whole life working for a corporation, but would rather be looking for the monster or doing something else, whatever looking for your monster is.
Yes.
Most people would rather do that than be in a cubicle, but it takes a fair, you know, sized pair of cojones to go and to do what Steve Felton did. We're winding down. I've got a couple more questions for you though. But when you were first researching and preparing to do the documentary, what was the one story that really, like, that you were flabbergasted by, that you were unaware of when you first found out?
Well, is it acceptable that I tell you a story that's actually not in the film, but I thought was kind of amazing? And
sure.
You might go, well, it should be in the film, but it sort of didn't entirely fit. But I spoke to, and we filmed this interview with this guy. There was a guy who worked for a zoo in the north of England, and they got somebody sent the zoo like a kind of sea lion. What are those sea lions with the big proboscis kind of nose things on them? From like the South Atlantic, there was like this massive seal thing, and they captured it, but it died on the way to the zoo, right? I mean, this was, you know, say what you want about zoos. This is the 1970s, and this guy was working there as a young person, and they put the corpse of this creature in the deep freeze, and you know, to study it at some later point. And then him and his friend had an idea, and they took the frozen kind of walrus thing, and they drove from the north of England to the Loch Ness, which was about 6-hour drive. And then in the middle of the night, they shaved off the whiskers of the sea lion, and they changed the shape of its mouth, and then they dragged it into the loch. and the next morning, they knew there was some scientists staying at the hotel, and the next morning they let someone else go, look, and they go, we found a baby Nessie, we found it, and they dragged it in. Right. And it was like, so this is a real animal, but you know, in 1970s, people haven't seen it. You know, it's like, and they dragged it in and thought, wow, we found a baby Loch Ness monster. But the bit that like had my jaw dropping was that then this guy and his friend, they were sort of in the prank, but they wanted to take the body back. So they said, all right, we'll take it. And they put it in the back of their van and drove off with it. Whereupon the police in Scotland started chasing them through Scotland saying, you've stolen the Loch Ness Monster. You've stolen the Loch Ness Monster. And eventually, and then, I mean, it was like a caper. And then they switched vans at one point. And eventually, you know, like they got back to the zoo, you know, and, you know, no. The van got stopped on a bridge in Scotland, a very famous bridge in Scotland. And the police opened the van and, you know, they didn't kind of know what they were looking at. And they phoned an expert from Edinburgh Zoo who came along and said, oh, it's a sea lion. It's not a monster. And they said, oh, okay, you can go. But it was just such an extraordinary thing. And like, you know, it was very funny and it was in the news and all this. And then, so when I was making the story, weirdly, it was a great story, but it threw you out of the narrative too much. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of like you're trying to confect this kind of like claustrophobic atmosphere of what's happening on the loch. And this was this kind of madcap story that then was sort of a dead end, but it's a great story in itself. So that was the thing that tickled me, the idea that like, you know, in like some Ealing movie in the 1970s, the Scottish police were chasing a van that they believed was holding like a dead Nessie in it, and then had to set up a roadblock. So that was fun.
Wow. There's a whole documentary just in that.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, I've still got the rushes of the guy speaking somewhere, and I just sort of think like, you know, I might.
You should bang out a short. Just do the short circuit with it, the short fest circuit. Like,
no, I kind of think it is. There's something there that's interesting.
Speaking of, I guess, a filmmaking, and that you've the project's still out there and it's doing the circuit and playing other places, but has it bitten you, do you think, the Loch Ness Monster? Like, is it a part of you now? Is it something you're always going to be conscious of and interested in going forward?
I mean, yes. I mean, there's that weird thing. If you dedicate, like, you know, 8 months of your life to a project, then you've got a kind of stake in it, you know? And the funny thing is, like, you know, I'm not like a cryptozoologist. I'm not somebody who's kind of like follows that stuff. But now, you know, amongst people who know me and all that, is that, oh, you're the Loch Ness Monster guy? I'm sort of like, no. I'm the guy who's critiquing and standing, you know, and holding the whole Loch Ness Monster thing. And they're like, yeah, but do you believe? So it kind of like, you know, so after a while, you just got to own it. You know, you just got to go, okay, right, well, here's what I think. And I'll happily talk to anyone about it. And yeah, I mean, I'd like, you know, if you guys know other film festivals, I'm still trying to get it. The film's been out about a year. And in Britain, it's been on the BBC, and it's actually going to be on the BBC again on the 28th. But like elsewhere in the world, I'm still trying to get it shown. So if there is whispering amongst various people you speak to, Dean, please do recommend.
Oh, I absolutely would, and I can't recommend it enough, actually. And I will. Let's talk off air and see if we can think of some other fests that it should screen at, because not only is it an incredibly produced film and a gorgeous film, I think it's a very important film. I think that everybody knows the story of the Loch Ness Monster, but they don't know the real story. They don't know the story about the people who were crafting this legend, or who were engaging in it and were so responsible for publicizing it, I guess, or for making it what we think of as the Loch Ness Monster today. These things don't just come out of nowhere. There are often people involved in it. Do you think in your future you'd be interested in looking at anything else in the weird or the unusual as a filmmaker?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I find it fascinating and enjoyable, and I mean, this might sound a little bit trite, but you know, I'm interested in humans. You know, like it's that sort of thing of like, that's what's quite often interesting about these things. And like anyone else, you know, I love mystery stuff and love, like, when you watch any of those films, if it starts with like a fat bloke looking at a radar screen with his headphones on, and then there's a blip on the radar. I'm in. I love all that, you know. So yeah, I mean, I've got another project I'm trying to get away, but which is kind of to do with METI, you know, broadcasting messages into space. But nice. I don't know. It's like everyone else. It's you know, it's a full-time job trying to get any funding. So, you know, in a way, like Scotland is, you know, I know people here, but like to try and take on a bigger project worldwide is kind of like, it's just tricky to get the funds. But like a lot of ideas and a lot of, yeah, I mean, I love all that mystery stuff. And I, you know, like, if anyone wants to pay me to come and make They Created a Yeti, I'll happily do it. You know what I mean? It's like,
you know, there's a real story there, like about, like, is it Bob Slick who hired like Peter Byrne to go out and look for the Yeti and stuff? You would be the filmmaker to make that movie. Just saying.
Well, I mean, the thing about all that stuff is like, you know, you can't, even if there are people pulling strings, you can't really hate them because quite often they're not like, I don't think it's necessarily done from a cynical, bad place. I think it's done from like, and a lot of this was around Loch Ness as well. It's like, you know, the photograph of the flipper, you know, it turned out to be not as great as they initially thought without giving too much away. And, but I bet you would, like, you know, it's like a, you know, that kind of blot test. They looked at something and they wanted to believe. They weren't being like, haha, let's trick everyone. They were going, yeah, no, I can see it. Can you see it? You know, and like, you know, and so I think, you know, I just think there's something really interesting about that. And, you know, all the people I met during when I was making this, you know, they were all good people. And in fact, I don't know if you find this, Dean, and if you're doing this stuff, you know, everyone expects when you go to make a documentary about the supernatural or cryptozoology, like the people you meet will all be like wildly colorful people, like who are, you know, nuts but actually most of them are really rational people. And what they often try to do when confronted with a camera is to prove that they are like serious, like to show their credentials, which weirdly for storytelling then becomes a problem because you're like going, you know, if you're making something about UFOs, I bet you speak to lots of people and like they're very serious and almost scientific and almost scholarly, and you're going, yeah, but I need you to be a bit more excited about the prospect. I mean, and I found that a little bit with Loch Ness. Some of the older hands who'd been doing it for years, you know, you sort of go, well, you know, do you believe in it or whatever? And they are very guarded about what they say because they face ridicule quite a lot, and so they're very guarded. So it is a kind of like an interesting space to be in and or interesting world to talk about, but it is quite occasionally a bit, you know, it's not as entertaining as people might at first assume. You know, there's a lot of people who like, you just go, right, well, this is the story you're telling me is not that crazy as you think it might be, you know.
I'll have to introduce you off air to Doug Hychek, who is the founder and the person who runs the Untold Radio Network, which is where Talking Weird screens. He's a documentarian as well, and he was the creator and producer of Monster Quest. Monster Quest was,
right,
well, you know, it was probably the major show within this space in America in the last 20 years. It's still syndicated. Right. And Doug's an incredible talent. I often say this, and I always thought it even before I ever met Doug. My two favorite shows, which I think are watchable again and again, series is Monster Quest and In Search of course. I think both of those shows have a real longevity to them because of the way they approach things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That'd be good.
Well, it was wonderful to have you here. Are there any websites or anywhere else you would like to point anybody at, John, before I say
no,
goodbye?
not really. I mean, like my thing would just be like if people see the film and they like it and they can give me a thumbs up on Rotten Tomatoes, or they can, I mean, essentially you're showing it for the first time in the States, and I'm kind of, you know, I'm just keen to, you know, there's no point in making a film unless people see it. So it's not so much about like ego, like you have to see my film. It's more like I go, well, I think people will find it good fun, and I think we'll enjoy it, and it's a little slice of social history from, you know, that is good fun. And so I would like to just, you know, get it into other film festivals, get it kind of like, you know, see if I could get a TV channel or something to pick it up. But you know, yeah, I'm proud of the film, and I think it is, you know, all the people who were in it also liked it. So I was kind of pleased about that, because, you know, you don't want to make a film and then when you speak to people afterwards, they go, you know, you've done me wrong. So, you know, the people who were in it all were happy with it. So, you know, all that adds up, and you know, I just kind of want now for people to enjoy it and you know, enjoy the ride, as it were.
Well, Loch Ness, they created a monster. I think whether somebody's a skeptic or whether they're a believer, I think they're going to completely enjoy this film. It's very balanced. I can't say how delighted I am that I got to see it and that we're screening it at MidWest WeirdFest, which runs March 6 to 9 at the Micon Downtown Cinema in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. So anybody who can get into that, please do come and see the movie, because it's incredible. And going forward, when I know of any more announcements, I will certainly advertise them on both the festival site and on my own Facebook page as well. It's an incredible film, and everybody really needs to see it. John, thank you so much for visiting me. It was such a wonderful chat tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. And, you know, I am happy to talk about mythical Scottish stuff anytime.
As am I. And until I get to talk to you again, John, and until I get to talk to everybody else out there, please keep it weird.